What's up, Applied English? Let's pray, and we'll get right into our Day 18 lesson here to finish off our 6-week grading period. Dear Lord Jesus, thank you for this day. Thank you for the opportunity to teach in person and virtually. I do pray, God, that my students in class will be successful as they get some work done with me. I also pray for my virtual students as they continue to utilize the resources that I give them virtually. I pray that you are helping me to teach well, and I pray that you're helping them to learn well and limit distractions as they are at home. We do pray, God, that you continue to watch over us and protect us from the coronavirus. We also want to pray along the same lines of our chapels this week, that you are helping us to find rest in the unrest, but that you're also building us up so that we can show the world who you are and show the world the peace that comes from knowing Jesus Christ. We love you, Jesus. We pray this all in your name. Amen. So I know that our grade book is kind of assignment city right now, as we have been doing kind of a series of short assignments recently with some longer deadlines. You should know that our quiz inside of today's lesson folder is our last assignment that's going in on our current grading period. So I'm hoping we can use the weekend, maybe the first couple of days of next week, to wrap up any work we might be working on. My goal is to use today to catch up in all of my Applied English grade books. I do have some grading to do, so I'm hoping to find some time during the school day today to work through that. Please reach out to me, contact me on Microsoft Teams if you are having trouble catching up on missing work. 2 objectives today. One is to utilize new vocabulary words, our African American vocabulary set from 2 weeks ago. Another is to identify and correct comma errors in writing, as we've been working on all week. Both of these objectives are inside of your African American Lit vocab quiz, which we'll take a look at in a moment here. One thing I would note is that your African American Lit vocab quiz is not due until the end of Sunday, so if you need some time to study your words, go online, see my comments on your vocab words, you can. The main thing we'll be looking at in this video is our reading for the first half of Just Mercy, Chapter 10. I also want to give you some background on the author, Bryan Stevenson, just in case you don't know the story very well. We will be working on a writing assignment for this reading next week, but that one has a longer deadline as well and will not be on this grading period. I am splitting Just Mercy between 2 lessons, so we'll finish reading it, probably the last 5 pages or so, on Monday, which also should give you some time to start the writing for it if you choose. Once again, African American Literature vocab quiz. I just want to click on that real quick here as a reminder for you. The main thing I want you to note here is that this quiz does have a time limit. It's 25 minutes, just like the last one, so you guys should be fine as you take this one. Once again, just use each word once as you're used to using it. One thing to note, you can use your parts of speech strategies to help. So the firefighters had a sense of blank as they rushed the children away from the flames. Of is a preposition, so we need an object of the preposition, a noun here. Our 4 nouns were prejudice, fidelity, urgency, and enterprise. Sorry, I missed that first one. So you have 4 options there. Choose the one that best fits in that blank. You will not use that word again after you use it once, so it's wise to keep a piece of scratch paper and keep track of the words as you use them. These are also skippable, so let's say you don't know number 2 well. Normally Texas is blank, but now it's covered in snow. Maybe you don't know what goes there. Skip it, maybe flag it, come back to it later once you have more words eliminated. The last 5 questions are all comma questions. So you might say a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. You have to decide basically whether you need a comma or a different punctuation mark between dreamer and but. These are ACT style, so again, no change is an option on these ones. Feel free to use your eliminate choices buttons to get rid of the ones that you know are wrong. Before we look at our reading for Just Mercy, we should probably take a look at what our writing assignment next week consists of. It says this: Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy exposes a number of inequities in American society today. Inequity is the idea that something is unfair for a people group. It's not necessarily inequality, where something is not equal between 2 people groups, but that something is unfair. There's a little bit of a difference there. Specifically, Just Mercy focuses on the criminal justice system. It especially focuses on unfair prison sentencing and treatment in prison conditions for African Americans, children, and the poorest people in the United States. It also covers other issues in our society today. It's a fairly long book. It covers things like racial prejudice, domestic violence in the home, mental illness, and so on. What we're going to do is read most of Chapter 10 of the text. There's a little bit that I'm going to cut out for time, but I am giving you the entire text that you can read on your own. I want you to identify one social issue that Stevenson encountered in this chapter, big or small. The two big ones that he deals with in chapter 10 are how the criminal justice system treats people with mental illnesses, especially. Another social issue is racial prejudice that he encounters himself, an interaction that he has with a prison guard. Although you can choose any other smaller issues mentioned in chapter 10, there are a number of them. In a 5 to 10 sentence paragraph, I want you to explain how Stevenson dealt with this issue and what the end result was. If you want to go a different direction with this paragraph, you could choose to focus on what can be done in our society today to solve the problem that you identified in this chapter. Just Mercy was written in 2014, so these are relatively recent issues. Our society has made gains with them over this past decade or so, but these are certainly issues that still last in America today. In addition to writing your paragraph, this is something a little bit new for our writing assignments. I also want you to comment on one or more of your classmates' posts. There is no length limit on your comment. It can be one sentence if you want it to be. I do want it to be in complete sentences. Your comment should be two things. One is constructive, so does it build up the person you're commenting on? This could be an agreement, a respectful disagreement, a compliment, making a further observation, asking a clarifying question, and so on. The other thing that your comment should be is respectful. So please watch your tone as you guys are discussing with one another about this text. I am grading your paragraph out of 15 points this time, so the same 6 for paragraph structure and 4 for overall grammar as your last paragraph discussion. The last 5 points comes from your comment on a classmate's post. Again, is it constructive? Is it in complete sentences? And is it respectful? Notice that this is not due until the end of next week. So that's mostly just to give you some time to read each other's posts and comment as well. What I am going to do next week is try to keep our assignments in class as much as possible next week so that you have time to do this too. This is not going on our current grade report. It'll go on our next one. That being said, let's get right into our reading for Just Mercy. So it says, please watch this video for an introduction to Bryan Stevenson. That's his smiling face right there. We'll do the first half of our reading for Just Mercy in this lesson. I have included this background PowerPoint that you can look at on your own. I've also given you a copy of all of Just Mercy chapter 10. I'm going to click view on that now so I can open that up, get ready for reading. All right, let's talk about Bryan Stevenson a little bit here. Of our African American literature writers so far, he's the only one who is still alive. So far we've done Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington last week, focused especially on Black progress getting out of slavery and entering into kind of the corporate world, entering into the educational world. This week we focused on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., so focused on equality. The focus of Bryan Stevenson's work is largely on equity, as we mentioned a little bit ago. Let's talk about Bryan Stevenson's background here a little bit. Bryan Stevenson was raised in the civil rights era. So he was born on November 14th, 1959 in Milton, Delaware. Just for context, right, Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech was in 1965 when Stevenson would have been 5 or 6 years old. Because he grew up in a time where multiple civil rights acts were signed, he did witness desegregation throughout his young life. As I was doing a little bit of research, I think I saw that his the first time he went to a school that was desegregated was in the 2nd grade. His family did greatly value education and Christian faith. So a little bit of a commonality that we can find with him as we are high school students and as we're drawing from a Christian background. He was an excellent high school student, straight A high school student, straight A college student. He did graduate from Harvard University with his Juris Doctor in 1985. Juris Doctor is the general degree that you would get if you plan to be a judge or plan to be an attorney. He became an attorney, a lawyer. At Harvard, he interned with a nonprofit organization called the Southern Center for Human Rights. They are an organization that works to represent especially death row inmates in the American South. Here he would also land his first job representing death row inmates in Alabama. That continues to be the main part of his work today. The biggest part of his body of work is founding an organization called the Equal Justice Initiative. Basically, he took the Southern Center that he was working for. They gave him an office in Atlanta, and he changed the name of it. A little bit of context about the EJI, Equal Justice Initiative. In the early 1990s, so about when I was born, Alabama had the worst death penalty system in the U.S. They had the highest number of people on death row. They also had the harshest system of representing them in court. They were the only state in the U.S. that did not provide free legal representation for death row inmates. What Bryan Stevenson did is he pooled his resources to represent defenseless death row inmates. He just wanted to give them a fighting chance in court. Through this, they did win a high-profile case in 1993. It was the Walter McMillian case. We'll talk about that in just a little bit here. It is the main focus of Just Mercy. After winning that, they started receiving more money, more workers, and the EJI also started to shift their focus to cases involving minors too. A couple of big victories there. In 2005, EJI did win a big case in the U.S. Supreme Court, which led to the Supreme Court banning the death penalty for any offenders under the age of 18. So, let's say if I was 16 and accidentally killed someone, no court can say you're going to be in prison for 2 years and then you're on death row as soon as you're 18. That's illegal. They did the same thing in 2012 to ban life without parole sentences for children under 17. The same thing exists. Once again, I accidentally kill someone at the age of 16. I can't be charged as an adult and given a life sentence without the ability to earn parole. These are big victories that the EJI has had over these last couple decades. EJI still exists as an organization. They continue to fight against the death penalty. They want to see it banned entirely. They have a problem with mass incarceration, just the idea that our prisons are overfilled. They want to see criminal justice reform. They're against excessive, cruel, and unusual punishment, dangerous prison conditions for inmates, and racial bias in the justice system, too. They have overturned the death penalty for over 125 people since they began in the early 90s. So that means that they have either proved the innocence of or reduced the sentences for 125 people on death row over these past 30 years. He did document the big body of his work in his book, Just Mercy, which was published in 2014. The book mainly details his work on the Walter McMillian case. Every other chapter kind of tells that story in order. In the alternating chapters, he discusses other injustices and other cases the Equal Justice Initiative has worked. Chapter 10, the one that we'll be reading, is one of these alternating chapters where he discusses a different case. Walter McMillian, in that case, he had been charged with murdering a white woman in Monroeville, Alabama. I'm not going to go into a ton of details about his trial, but his trial was extremely poorly handled. On top of that, the judge took the jury's verdict of giving McMillian a life sentence and actually made it worse by issuing him the death penalty instead. Walter McMillian, as an innocent man, waited on death row for 6 years before Stevenson was able to prove his innocence in court in 1993. So a big victory. It's one of the highest profile cases of a death penalty sentence being overturned in recent years. McMillian did die in 2013, a little bit early, partially due to some health issues he developed while he was on death row. You guys should know, Just Mercy was also adapted as a feature-length film in 2019. In this film, Stevenson is played by Michael B. Jordan. I have a picture of that in just a moment here. Walter McMillian was played by Jamie Foxx. Both the book and the film have won numerous awards for being good storytelling. There's Bryan Stevenson along with Michael B. Jordan, who played a younger version of himself in the film. I've also included the link to Equal Justice Initiative right here, so if you want to learn more about the work they do, click on that. It'll take you right to their website. You can read about what they do. I want to move on into the text here. Alright, you'll have to deal with my scrolling a little bit here as we read this chapter together. But this is Chapter 10, Mitigation. Notice our vocab word, mitigate, to lessen something, to lessen the damage from something. That's going to be a big focus of this chapter, which we'll divide into 2 parts. Once again, I'm just going to read through this one. I want you to enjoy this chapter, but I also want you to keep in mind our writing prompt. Choose one specific social issue that Stevenson encounters in this chapter, and kind of explain what he does about this issue and what the end result is. America's prisons have become warehouses for the mentally ill. Mass incarceration has been largely fueled by misguided drug policy and excessive sentencing. But the imprisonment, of hundreds of thousands of poor and mentally ill people has been a driving force in achieving our record levels of imprisonment. It's created unprecedented problems. I first met Avery Jenkins over the telephone. He called me, but he was pretty incoherent. He couldn't explain what he had been convicted of, or even clearly describe what he wanted me to do. He complained about the conditions of his confinement until a random thought caused him to abruptly switch topics. There's a good former vocab term right there, abruptly, suddenly. He sent letters too, but they were just as hard to follow as his phone calls, so I decided to speak with him in person to see if I can make better sense of how to help. You do have access to this entire chapter, but these next couple pages I'm going to skip. He's largely giving background about mental health in the criminal justice system. These next couple paragraphs get kind of complex, so you can read them on your own if you like. They are filled with really interesting statistics and history of how our prison system has handled people with mental health issues. I'm going to pick up on 189 with I once represented. So if you're finding that right there, again, page 189, I once represented. I once represented a mentally ill man on Alabama's death row named George Daniel. George had suffered brain damage in a car accident that knocked him unconscious late one night in Houston, Texas. When he woke up, he was in an upside-down car on the side of the road. He went home that night and never sought medical assistance. His girlfriend later told his family that he just seemed a little off. Then he started hallucinating and exhibiting increasingly bizarre and erratic behavior. He stopped sleeping regularly, complained about hearing voices, and on 2 occasions ran out of the house naked because he thought he was being chased by wasps. Within a week of the accident, he had stopped speaking in sentences. Just before his mother, who lived in Montgomery, was summoned to help persuade him to go to a hospital, George boarded a Greyhound bus in the middle of the night. He traveled as far as the money he had in his pocket would take him. Disoriented and uncommunicative, he was forced off the bus in Hurtsboro, Alabama, after unnerving some passengers by talking loudly to himself and gesturing wildly at objects he imagined were flying around him. The bus had gone through Montgomery, where he had family, but he stayed on until he was thrown off, with no money and wearing jeans, a t-shirt, and no shoes in the middle of January. He wandered around Hurtsboro and eventually stopped at a house. He knocked on the door, and when the homeowner opened it, George walked inside without being invited and roamed around until he found the kitchen table where he sat down. The alarmed homeowner called her son, who came and physically removed George from the house. George went to another home owned by an older woman and did the same thing. She called the police. The officer who responded had a reputation for being aggressive, and he forcefully removed George from the home. George started resisting while being pulled to the police car, and the 2 men began wrestling and fell to the ground. The officer pulled his weapon, and the 2 were grappling over the gun when it discharged, shooting the officer in the stomach. He died from the gunshot wound. George was arrested and charged with capital murder. While in the Russell County Jail, he became acutely psychotic. Officers reported that he wouldn't leave his cell. He was observed eating his own feces. His mother visited him, but he didn't recognize her. He couldn't speak in complete sentences. The 2 lawyers who were appointed to represent him at his capital trial were primarily concerned that only one of them would be paid the $1,000 for out-of-court time that Alabama provided lawyers appointed in capital cases. They began squabbling with each other, and one filed a civil suit against the other about who would claim the money. Pausing here for a moment, one possible issue you could write about, on top of things like racism or just mental health issues in general here, is poor representation, bad representation in court for our most vulnerable people. Notice here that George does not get good representation in court. His lawyers care more about how they're getting paid than actually defending him. Meanwhile, the judge sent George to Bryce Hospital in Tuscaloosa for a competency exam. Ed Seeger, the doctor who examined George, mysteriously concluded that he was not mentally ill, but was malingering or faking symptoms of a mental illness. Based on that evaluation, the judge allowed the capital murder trial to proceed. George's lawyers bickered with one another, presented no defense, and called no witnesses. The state called Dr. Seeger, who persuaded the jury that there was nothing mentally wrong with George, even as he continuously spit in a cup and made loud clucking noises throughout the trial. George's family members were distraught. George had been working at Pier 1 Furniture in Houston before his car accident. He left town without picking up his check, which had been ready for collection over 2 days before his departure. His mother, a poor woman who knew the value of $1 to someone like George, found this behavior more demonstrative of a mental illness than anything else she could point to, and she authorized the lawyers to obtain the unclaimed check in the hope that they would present it at the trial to confirm George's confused mental state. The lawyers, who are bickering over the money, cash the check to pay themselves instead of using it as evidence. George was convicted and given the death penalty. By the time we at EJI got involved, he had been on death row for several years, moving inexorably toward execution. When I met him, prison doctors were heavily medicating him with psychotropic drugs, which at least stabilized his behavior. It was so abundantly clear that George was mentally ill that it came as no shock when we discovered that the doctor who had examined him at Bryce Hospital was a fraud, with no medical training. Dr. Ed Seeger had made up his credentials. He had never graduated from college, but had fooled hospital officials into believing he was a trained physician with expertise in psychiatry. He had masqueraded at the hospital for 8 years, conducting competency evaluations on people accused of crimes before his fraud was uncovered. I represented George in his federal court proceedings. There, the state acknowledged that Seeger was an imposter, but wouldn't agree that George was entitled to a new trial. We eventually won a favorable ruling from a federal judge, who overturned his conviction and sentence. Because of his mental illness and incompetency, George was never retried or prosecuted. He has been in a mental institution ever since, but there are likely hundreds of other people imprisoned after an evaluation by Dr. Seeger, whose convictions have never been reviewed. That little story right there gives you a nice little picture of some of the issues, some of the injustices that people who have mental illnesses face in the criminal justice system. A lot of my clients on death row have had serious mental illnesses, but it wasn't always obvious that their history of mental illnesses predated their time in prison, since symptoms of their disabilities could be episodic and were frequently stress-induced. But Avery Jenkins' letters, handwritten in print so small I needed a magnifying glass to read them, convinced me that he had been very ill for a long time. I looked up his case and began to piece together his story. It turned out he had been convicted of the very disturbing and brutal murder of an older man. The multiple stab wounds inflicted on the victim strongly suggested mental illness, but the court records and files never referenced anything about Jenkins suffering from a disability. I thought I'd find out more by meeting him in person. When I pulled into the prison parking lot, I noticed a pickup truck that looked like a shrine to the Old South. It was completely covered with disturbing bumper stickers, Confederate flag decals, and other troubling images. Confederate flag license plates are everywhere in the South, but some of the bumper stickers were new to me. A lot were about guns and Southern identity. One read, "If I'd have known it was going to be like this, I'd have picked my own damn cotton." Despite growing up around images of the Confederate South, and working in the Deep South for many years, I was pretty shaken by the symbols. This is another spot where I'm going to skip just a couple of paragraphs for the sake of time. These are interesting paragraphs, especially if you plan to write about the issues of Confederate symbols and hate speech in your paragraph here. But these next few paragraphs just kind of explain some of the history of Confederate symbols and what they mean, especially in the black community. He writes a little bit about the Ku Klux Klan in these couple of paragraphs here too. We're going to pick up towards the bottom of page 193 here. At a pretrial hearing, I once argued against the exclusion of African Americans from the jury pool. In this particular rural southern community, the population was about 27% black, but African Americans made up only 10% of the jury pool. After presenting the data and making my arguments about the unconstitutional exclusion of African Americans, the judge complained loudly. "I'm going to grant your motion, Mr. Stevenson, but I'll be honest. I'm pretty fed up with people always talking about minority rights. African Americans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans. When is someone going to come into my courtroom and protect the rights of Confederate Americans?" The judge had definitely caught me off guard. I wanted to ask if being born in the South or living in Alabama made me a Confederate American, but I thought better of it. I stopped in the prison yard to take a closer look at the truck. I couldn't help walking around it and reading the provocative stickers. I turned back toward the front gate of the prison, trying to regain my focus, but I couldn't make myself indifferent to what I had perceived were symbols of racial oppression. I had been to this prison often enough to be familiar to many of the correctional officers. But as I entered, I was met by an officer I had never seen before. He was a white man of my height, about 6 feet tall, with a muscular build. He looked to be in his early 40s and wore a short military haircut. He was staring coldly at me with steel blue eyes. I walked toward the gate that led to the lobby of the visitation room, where I expected a routine pat-down before entering the visitation area. The officer stepped in front of me and blocked me from proceeding. "What are you doing?" he snarled. "I'm here for a legal visit," I replied. "It was scheduled earlier this week. The people in the warden's office have the papers." I smiled and spoke as politely as I could to defuse the situation. That's fine, but you have to be searched first." It was difficult to ignore his clearly hostile attitude, but I did my best. "Okay, do you need me to take my shoes off?" The hardcore officers would sometimes make me remove my shoes before going inside. "You're going to go into that bathroom and take everything off if you expect to get into my prison." I was shocked, but I spoke as nicely as I could. "Oh, no, sir. I think you might be confused. I'm an attorney. Lawyers don't have to get strip searched to come in for legal visits." Instead of calming him, this seemed to make him angrier. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but you're not coming into my prison without complying with our security protocols. Now you can get into that bathroom and strip, or you can go back to wherever you came from." If this makes you angry, good. This is injustice. This is one of the things you could write about, is the racial prejudice, the racism that Stevenson himself encounters in this chapter. It does have a positive ending, I promise. I'd had some difficult encounters with officers getting into prisons from time to time, mostly in small county jails or places where I'd never been before, but this was highly unusual. I've been to this prison many times, and I've never been required to submit to a strip search. I don't think this is procedure, I said more firmly. "Well, I don't know and don't care about what other people do, but this is the protocol I use." I thought about trying to find an assistant warden, but realized that might be difficult. And anyway, an assistant warden would be unlikely to tell an officer he was wrong in front of me. I had driven 2 hours for this visit, and had a very tough schedule over the next 3 weeks. I wouldn't be able to get back to the prison anytime soon if I didn't get in now. I went inside the bathroom and removed my clothes. The officer came in and gave me an unnecessarily aggressive search. Before mumbling that I was clear, I put my suit back on and walked out. I'd like to get inside the visitation room now. I tried to reclaim some dignity by speaking more forcefully. "Well, you have to go back and sign the book." He said it coolly, but he was trying to provoke me. There was a visitation log that the prison used for family visits, but it was not used for legal visits. I had already signed the attorney book. It would make no sense to sign a second book. "Lawyers don't have to sign that book. If you want to come into my prison, you'll sign the book." He seemed to be smirking now. I tried hard to keep my composure. I turned around and went over to the book and signed my name. I walked back to the visitation room and waited. There was a padlock on the glass door that had to be unlocked before I could enter the space where I'd meet my client. The officer finally pulled out his keys to unlock the door. I stood silently, hoping to get inside without more drama. When he opened the door, I stepped forward, but he grabbed my arm to stop me. He lowered his voice as he spoke to me. "Hey man, did you happen to see a truck out in the visitation yard with a lot of bumper stickers, flags, and a gun rack?" I spoke cautiously. "Yes, I saw that truck." His face hardened before he spoke. "I want you to know, that's my truck." He released my arm and allowed me to walk inside the prison. I felt angry at the guard, but I was even more irritated by my own powerlessness. I was distracted from my thoughts when the back door of the visitation room opened and Mr. Jenkins was led in by another officer. The halfway point of this text anyway, so we'll cover the second half in our Monday lesson coming up here in a couple of days. What's coming up for us in this chapter is how Avery Jenkins' case was resolved. So we'll see a little bit more about how Bryan Steven argued that case in the courtroom. We'll also see another interaction between Bryan Stevenson and this very clearly prejudiced prison guard that he just had this really negative interaction with. I do promise you that this chapter has a positive ending, so you'll get to see how some of these issues that we're thinking about get resolved, but this gives you a way to start thinking about what you'd like to write about next week. Once again, you do have all weekend to take your vocabulary quiz whenever you are ready. Do all the studying you need before you take it. We will finish up this text on Monday, and we're moving into a study of African American poetry in class next week.